Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
Today we are joined by Joe Blankholm, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's here to discuss his book, The Secular Paradox, and to give us some of the details from his examination of non-religious organization in the U.S. Joe, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, so much for coming on. We really enjoyed your book and looking forward to getting into it. Just to begin, well, your book is called The Secular Paradox. What do you mean by the secular paradox? What is the secular paradox exactly?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to make matters more confusing, the subtitle's on the religiosity of the not religious.
Right.
So
Right.
I don't know that it resolves a lot of the question provoked by the title. Yeah, so it's really just what I think of as like the secular condition. It's how it feels to be secular, and it's the cause for that feeling. So it's an ambivalence toward religion that's fundamental to being secular, which means really to be absolutely not religious at the same time that you share other beliefs about the world, affirm things that are true with other like-minded people who are also secular, and maybe even form communities or participate in rituals and do religion-like things, and are certainly part of a longer tradition since people don't just arrive out of nowhere. And so it's this tension between being absolutely not religious, but living in this Christian-centered culture, seeming in some ways like religion, and being legally religious, and having to negotiate that boundary in ways big and small, through feeling and through conscious decision.
Damn. So that's a lot. Is that secular paradox particular to secular people then, or is this something that can be something more generalized to people who are not Christian, let's say?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's difficult to generalize it further, and it almost depends on what you mean by secular. And I've had to think through different ways of understanding what religion is in order to have some working understanding of what secular is. And so I've learned that we have a really Christian centered idea of religion. The way I think about religion right now, my working definition of it is that which is analogous to Christianity. And that holds pretty well legally. And it holds pretty well for thinking about the 19th century development of the world religions that Tomoko Masuzawa writes about, for instance. And so even if I'm watching my own thoughts and feelings, and I encourage my students to do this as well, in part because I just sort of love this paranoid exercise, but if I'm watching my own feelings and thinking about what's religion, I find myself referring back to Christianity as the tacit model. And so if we're going to think about what's secular, we have to think like, okay, if it's not religious, then it's not Christian-like. But then we have to kind of break apart what we mean by religion. And political scientists and sociologists now talk about this, the three B's. I find it really helpful: belief, behavior, and belonging. So then it's, am I not religiously believing? Am I not religiously belonging? Am I not religiously behaving? Do I need to be all three to be secular? Easiest example for thinking about this is the religiously unaffiliated, the so-called nuns, NONES. And so, they don't belong religiously, but when we dig in, we find that they do all kinds of religious things. Like some of them pray daily, and some of them believe in God and a Christian-like God or a higher power. And so when we're thinking of secular negating one of the three aspects, the three B's, it just gets really tricky really quickly. And so I guess I don't mean to punt that question so much as to just say, it's really hard to think through the negative half of the secular and arrive at anything especially coherent. Where it gets more coherent is the positive half. And so that there's a tradition, a shared set of beliefs or things people affirm are true, practices, literal networks of people that I studied, that positive side, that's more unity. And so I think talking about, the people who are religiously unaffiliated or broadly are not religious, it's maybe too much heterogeneity to really pin down. And then, so what I mean by secular is in some ways that combination of the negative half and the positive half.
Mm. So let's get to things that we can probably wrap our heads around and maybe even our hands around. Um, it's weird. This is a new book, and yet I think it opens in 2013. That's a long time ago. How long have
Tell
you
me
been
about it.
working on this? What was the impetus to begin research into secular organizations?
I wish I could say I saw this project in its entirety as a graduate student at Columbia working on my PhD, but it's been a long road. And I think that it's taken me a long time to see some of the things that I hope I can now put elegantly, and I can give people shortcuts so they can take a more direct path uh, through my wandering. And so I got onto this project. I was originally, working on a PhD in anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. I'd spent a summer in Zambia working on evangelicals. It's the only officially Christian nation in Africa, and really thinking about church state questions through that lens. And then had a lot of trepidation about doing that work. Didn't feel comfortable telling Zambians about their culture. Was trained in kind of a cultural studies, comparative literature background as an undergraduate. Felt like I needed to know my own culture better, and reacted to that by refocusing on, I guess you'd say, like a colonial or European American center, and asking, what would an anthropology of secularism or what would an anthropology of atheism look like? Started a PhD at Columbia, found that was a really good place to pursue that type of work, and tried to take up, Talal Assad. He writes in the beginning of Formations of the Secular that he's going to do an anthropology of secularism, but there's not a lot of secular people in that book, and it's not a very on the ground book, even though it's one that's radically transformed how I think, and I'm deeply indebted to it. So what would that look like? And I tried to answer that question, and it was much harder than I thought it would be to figure that out. So I wrote a dissertation, which I finished in 2015, and I tried once to turn that into a book and received some very helpful, very critical feedback that told me I had failed miserably to do so.
Right.
And so then I started again, and I ended up with something I think that's far better, which is the current book. And I think it's more to the point and more to the heart of the questions that I set out to answer a long time ago.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things Todd and I were talking about earlier before you came on was just you have a lot of like narrative passages in the book where you're sort of describing your own research, like you're attending a atheist meetup or something like this. And I think like it's makes the book a lot more approachable and readable. I think to have these kind of examples illustrating your points. Maybe you can just tell us like what your research consisted of for the book.
Yeah. So, when I first started out, so I'm going to do an anthropology of atheism. I'm going to do an anthropology of secularism. And I live in New York City, and you can't throw a rock without being an atheist. And so it's very hard because I'm totally immersed. But what I started to find, I started to go to like atheist meetups and started to get more into secular activism, trying to understand the activism that people are doing in groups like the Secular Coalition for America, which is a lobbying organization. And I realized that there was this entire network of groups that had leadership that sometimes was shared. Sometimes people would move around. They all knew each other. They'd have conferences. And there was a whole thing there. And it was happening at the national level, but also the local level. So later on, with a colleague, Alfredo Garcia, he and I built a database of all the local non-believer communities in the country where people get together face to face, and found that there are about 1,400. I've since revalidated that, and there's about 1,350, and there's about 1/3 churn over just a few years between that revalidation. So there's a fairly stable number of them, but they turn over a lot. And then the ethnography that I did focused mostly on the national organizations. And so I went to their headquarters all throughout the United States. I went to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's headquarters in Madison, Wisconsin, went out to New Jersey and visited American Atheists, played a few hands of poker with them because the director at the time, Dave Silverman, was preparing for a poker tournament, I believe. A little bit
All
surreal.
right.
I went out to Los Angeles and visited the James Randi Education Foundation, CFI West. Went to a conference in New Orleans that the American Humanist Association was holding that year. Went up to Buffalo, Amherst, really, where the Center for Inquiry is based. Visited their headquarters. They have an amazing free thought library there. And so went all over just trying to map the network of people who lead these groups and to learn from them. Because I think my first impulse when I started this work was like, oh, I'm going to be able to see who the true atheists are here, or I'm going to settle these debates that these people have been having for centuries with my incredible insights. And in fact, what I found is that they're incredibly smart people I'm talking to, and they've already thought about all of this. And if I just shut up and listen, they have so much to teach me. And so I got really into that for a few years and just followed them around, followed them to DC and went to lobbying outfits and all kinds of stuff. So that's really the heart of the book is a little over 100 interviews with those folks, but also just going to dozens of events and hanging out and learning from them on the ground and having lots of informal conversations as well.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what makes it such an engaging read. And one of the things I noticed with the people you interview, people that you're talking to, is that they often come across like they're building their identity, right? As both secular people and or maybe as something else, right? That they need to introduce themselves as libertarians in the first 5 minutes. And it seems like this is a larger project for atheists or non-religious people, changing what the perception is by building their own identity. And we've talked to people here who've faced similar pressures the other way, as you find in the book. Black atheists who are told, to their face, you can't be black and be an atheist, right? That's not how this identity works. And you talk to Mexicans who connect religion to Mexican identity. Do you see this as part of identitarian politics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's impossible not to see it as part of identitarian politics when I'm looking at the groups I'm looking at, because they're so identity based, and the national level is constantly struggling with this problem of the labels. And so, are we going to call ourselves freethinkers, secular, atheists, agnostic?
Of course. Yeah.
What are we going to do? And so, the lack of an overarching identity in a single term instigates all of this conversation around identity. And then there's all this other stuff that goes with it. And then when you're talking about groups that are doing lobbying, the Secular Coalition for America wants to say, hey, a third of the country has no religious affiliation. That means a third of the country is secular. So they want that really, really big tent. That allows them to go to Congress people and say, there's more of us than you realize. Even if when we hammer into that data and sort of parse it out, we see that it's a little bit more of a complex picture. And so I think identity is really at the core, and it's partly because of who I've chosen. I think of very secular people like the ones that I spent time with as people who experience the secular paradox most intensely. So they're the ones who allow us to see it most clearly. Though, as someone who's also secular myself, and maybe not as invested in some of these questions, certainly doesn't go around thinking of that as a primary identity of mine, I experience this same ambivalence, and I see it among my friends who are perhaps even less firm in their secularity than me. And so I think identity is really common for the people that I'm talking to and learning from most as a kind of governing logic. But this question of identity is really hard to avoid when you're in a Christian-centered culture and thinking about questions like religion. It's this deeper issue too of like, just because I don't believe myself to have beliefs, do I in fact not believe anything? That's a tough one.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I think you had one of the people you talked to did make that claim, like they don't believe anything, but they accept or reject things based on evidence. Is that the case? Is that the case? Am I remembering that right?
That's totally right. I call him
Okay.
Ishmael. It was an amazing conversation. He's such a fun conversationalist. So he's one of the few people I've never met that I interviewed on the phone. And we had a bunch of stops and starts to our interview, and he's just a ball of energy shot out of a cannon. And so it was a wonderful conversation. And at that point, I had done probably more than 70 interviews. And so I understood how touchy certain terms can be. And after about an hour of interviewing him, I just said, "Can you tell me about some things you believe?" And then I rephrased it, but I knew what I'd done. And,
Right.
it's sort of, I guess you'd say it's kind of an experimental method, but the fact is, if you're an ethnographer, you're constantly experimenting with people just by showing up and trying to talk to anyone about anything. And so I, I invited him to think about the problem with me. And he's super smart and he had all kinds of interesting things to say, but yeah, he hated the word belief. And that's deeply in contrast to one of the early experiences I had. I was in upstate New York, going to a conference for ethical culture. Ethical culture is a 19th century movement that started in 1876, was founded by Felix Adler, the son of a major synagogue in New York at the time. And ethical culture, a lot of the people identify as religious, even though they're non-theists. And I had this moment as a kind of bright-eyed grad student where I went and was asking, I was like, I'm studying non-believers. So I'm here to, hang out and learn things. And this guy called Roger, he says, "I'm not a non-believer. We believe in a lot of things." And he's genuinely angry with me. And I wrote this whole interaction down in my field notes. And it's one of the ones that I didn't actually go back to until I was writing the book. And I'm reading my field notes and I'm like, "What's wrong with you? Why were you confused by this? This makes perfect sense." And then I'm like, I didn't understand this debate about whether one has beliefs or doesn't have beliefs and how that can mark a person as friendly or hostile to religion. And Roger was telling me, I'm not one of those anti-religion atheists. And he was using the category of belief to express his similarity to what he understood to be religious people. And Ishmael was, of course, he's deeply anti-religious. And so he was avoiding that term because it had this symbolic meaning. And so this question of having beliefs or not having beliefs is really sticky. It's hard to say that none of us have assumptions we make about the world. Whether or not we want to call those beliefs is itself a matter of dispute.
Yeah, I mean, that struck me. It's not something I had run into, atheists who didn't believe anything. I equate that more with nihilism. But it does lead into something that we've asked a lot on this show. We've never come to an answer. We've asked ourselves, and we think we're building to an answer. We always think we're almost there. And it's about atheism having a positive philosophy. And I think you talk to people who actively debate this a lot, and there's no conclusion. This seems to be part of the paradox as well. That, I mean, well, maybe I should put it to you. I'm trying to think of a good way to put this into a question, or maybe just clarification. Can you walk us through like this part of the paradox, whether or not atheism has itself a positive philosophy, or is it just a complete negation?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's the core of the paradox. And I approach it in two different ways. So I can look at its effects as an anthropologist by going around and talking to people. So I can see whether they understand themselves to share things that they think are true with other people in the world, whether or not they call those things beliefs, because maybe for them belief has an association with it, that's a faith-based affirmation of what's true. And since they're relying on evidence to affirm what's true, then they aren't believing in things, they're knowing things. Of course, that kind of erases an epistemological faith in empiricism, and that's a deeper and interesting question. So I think this positive half lies there. It's, are there people talking to each other and understanding each other as like-minded? That tells me a lot as someone who's just trying to understand social life. It tells me that if they're doing that on such a scale, there's no way they're wrong. And a lot of humanists say, very expressly what we share is humanism. But of course, I don't know that I personally identify strongly with the humanist philosophy, but I agree with them about a lot of things. I'm sort of trained in an anti-humanist tradition that's sometimes called critical theory in the academy. That's influenced me deeply. And so, but I agree with them on many things. And so there's this stuff that we share, and it's hard for us to acknowledge. And it's hard for us to acknowledge under the conditions of Christianity that frame us as a negation, as not religious. So I think there's a couple different inroads we can take to it. One is when we're talking about atheism, Is it that all atheists are unified because they don't believe in God? Or is it they're unified by a shared set of understandings that are related and maybe not affirmed like a creed, but are circumscribing a debate that they're having internally? And non-belief in God is incidental to those things that they think are true. And so then I think a lot of people would relate to that and feel the truth of that, because then atheism is really this sort of Christian question put to a positive set of assertions. But here we go. Now the pendulum wants to swing back, because once you share beliefs with other people, then you're too Christian one. You're too religious.
I see.
And so the pendulum's going to swing and it's going to erase itself. So that's when I'm studying the empirical effects. But I, much to the bemusement of my advisor in graduate school, also wanted to study the origin. And so the first dissertation chapter I gave her after I was on fellowship year and didn't have to TA was a frankly bizarre 85-page historiographical analysis of attempts to understand the history of atheism and when it arose. And she was literally like, I don't even think she gave me comments on it. She was like, "What are you doing? You're an anthropologist. This makes no sense."
Right.
But I tend to get obsessed with questions, and given free time and a lack of supervision, I explore them. And so what I was trying to do, I later realized, was find the origin of the secular paradox. And I think I found it. And so there's this strange thing where Christian theologians, Alan Charles Kors shows this pretty clearly. Christian theologians invented atheism before they were atheists. What does that mean? Super weird statement. But they were arguing dialectically in the wake of the integration of Aristotle by way of St. Thomas Aquinas. And so they wanted to find the thing that they disagreed with most to prove the validity of Christianity and the truth of God's existence. And so they invented atheism, but they didn't invent it out of sort of just nonsense. They looked to a lot of ancient sources, which disproportionately included ancient Epicureanism, but also some skepticism and some Stoicism. So Kors tracks this process of how atheism is created by Christian theologians, and then how later that sort of sets the stage for people who don't yet call themselves atheists to start to recover a coherent philosophy that we might call atheism that looks a lot like certain ancient thought. And so as that process slowly happens, you don't really have people calling themselves atheists, not very commonly, until, I don't find a lot of people doing it until the end of the 18th century.
Wait, so Joe, can you back up for a second?
Yeah.
Was that was that original atheist, that just sort of creation as a mental exercise, was that built as a straw man?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Because atheism just means heresy for most of its history. It still does, really.
So they're coming up
look
with
at ancient Greek.
Yeah. So they're coming up with arguments that they think are going to be easy to shoot down. And instead they create a cohesive philosophy of atheism.
Yeah, I actually think they're coming up with the best arguments they can. I think they're looking for the steel man instead of the straw man.
Oh, okay.
And they're doing a pretty good job a lot of times. And it leads to the Malebranchists and the Cartesians fighting each other and saying, you went too far. You guys are actually atheists now. Which is a fun battle to sort of watch play out, because atheist really, it just means heretic. And there's a lot of different heretics. And so when I was looking at the historiography, I'm like, whoa, there's a point in the history of atheism when historians have to decide, am I going to go look for the heretics, or am I going to go look for the proto-materialists, the proto-naturalists, the proto-physicalists? And I'm going to find the pieces of this more affirmative philosophy laid as a kind of trail of crumbs that I can dive back into, or am I going to follow the people that are getting, burned for heresy or going on heresy trials? And there's a split, but that means they unify at a certain point in the late 1700s is the closest point I found to it. And the French materialists say, yeah, we're atheists, and this really flip away, like appropriating queer in the 80s. And so then you have this positive philosophy married to this, at that point, almost probably about 2,000-year-old term for heretic. And the trouble begins, the unholy alliance that produces the secular paradox. So that to me is like the sort of origin. If you're going to look at, maybe if you think about it in medical terms, like the etiology versus the sort of diagnosis of the symptoms that I'm doing on the anthropological level. And I'm hoping that two of those things brought together can really highlight how weird this thing is, this combination of affirmative and negative that we can't really get ourselves out of.
But those worldviews that people just think are fact, right? So when people are confronted with saying they don't believe anything, they just believe evidence and facts based on science, and science itself has this worldview that they tacitly endorse. They're saying, I believe in the material world. I'm a materialist, right? They just don't know it or aren't aware of it, even though that structure's been built for them, that sort of atheist philosophy. Is
Yeah,
that too
that's
is that
basically
is
right.
that
I would
right or
say
too
it's
wordy or what?
no, no. I'd say it's kind of like it's almost like working materialist rather than materialist. I find this in the survey I conducted last year too, is that sort of secular people are more unified epistemologically than they are ontologically. So they agree more on how to know than what is clearly known. And so a lot of people will say, I'm an agnostic atheist. And what they mean is that there are certain kinds of truth, just sort of universal truth and knowledge, full certainty that are not available to them because you can only falsify hypotheses in the way they understand to know. And so they can't know for absolute certain that no God exists, but they live like no God exists. So they're functionally or sort of in a working way materialists, but they'll stop before they get to that ontological certainty because of their epistemological commitment to science and empiricism. And so that when I hear people do that, I think that that's genuinely capturing something. When I'm surveying people, there's a lot more agreement on empiricism than there is, and on science than there is on materialism. But generally, yeah, we're talking about materialism, and then that's God is incidental to that. Atheism is incidental to that. It's not the core, but we often call that set of beliefs atheism or identify as an atheist and mean, yeah, that's basically the stuff I believe. But then, then there's this question. Olav Hammer is a scholar who's done some work on new religious movement. He's a good scholar, and he's done some work on the skeptic movement, and he distinguishes the modern skeptic movement from ancient skepticism. It's such a good distinction he makes. And he says, the modern skepticism has faith in empiricism and takes it for granted that that's the correct way to know. And the ancient skeptics, they just go in. They're skeptical of all epistemological foundations. And so that difference really helped me understand a certain type of assumption that goes along with secular worldviews. And frankly, it's a set of assumptions I hold. I just have a more distant relationship to it now by way of reading people like Sextus Empiricus and having to confront in an infuriating way my own assumptions in there and their shaky foundations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I guess sort of related to that, I guess, is the question of whether there's something that unifies atheists or secular people, and I think another aspect of the paradox is just if they come sort of too close together into a community, they worry about, is this too much like a religion? I guess it's sort of an aversion to any kind of dogma or any kind of authority. Can you just maybe talk more about this sort of ambivalence towards community
Yeah,
or whatever? Yeah.
yeah, definitely. I've organized the book around chapters. There are different things toward which secular people feel ambivalent. So belief, community, ritual, conversion, and tradition. And so they all show the secular paradox, but in their own way. And absolutely, part of it is I had to figure out, when I'm talking to so many secular people, what's their working understanding of religion? Because it doesn't seem to resemble my own. In as much as I've gone through this hyper specialized training to be, that most ridiculous doctor is a doctor of religion. And so I have this different working understanding than they do, which is totally fine. And so mapping out their working understanding, I realized, right, they associate religion with groupthink, authoritarianism, creeds, irrationality, hierarchy. And so when they're avoiding certain things because they associate them too closely with religion, that's also shaping how they're secular. It's shaping what they're embracing. So you're a humanist who really believes, you have children and you want something like Sunday school because you found it beneficial for yourself growing up, and you want that for your children, and you find other families that want that too. How do you do it in a way that's not too religious? You need a working understanding of religion to know when you're getting too close to the line. And so that shoots a lot of secular organizing in the foot, because you can't have too strong a hierarchy, and anything that looks too much like tithing is totally unacceptable.
Yeah.
And so there's this limit that's encountered when people try to unify because they've come to resemble religion too closely, and the pendulum swings back. And so that sort of swinging between the affirmative and negative side, it structures the debates among people as well. So within a certain person, they might feel ambivalent, but if you step out and you sort of look at the larger community, the people around the country who are secular in various types of ways, there's not one way to do it. And there's conflict that's very reasonable and understandable given, the contradictions of the secular condition.
Yeah. So with that in mind, in terms of organizing, have you seen models that succeed, not in resolving the paradox, but at least like sustaining themselves? You talked earlier about how something like a third of the secular organizations have turned over in, what was it, 5 years? Are there any that are sufficiently that are long lived? And
Yeah.
do they avoid these problems, and how? I
Yeah,
guess.
it's a great question. It's in some ways, there's this deeper question of, is long lived really what you're looking for if you're secular too? And so,
Right.
ethical
Yes.
culture, they've been around for a long time. 64th and Central Park West, they have a building. They rent out the biggest room to an evangelical church because they can't afford to pay the rent, but they're there.
All right.
They
Wow.
persist. And so, and it's largely, but not entirely, older people. There's a community in St. Louis, I believe they're located. That's a lot of younger people than the New York Society for Ethical Culture, but is an aging group that has infrastructure the ideal in some ways? I'm not sure that it is, but that's an example of a lot of continuous success. In Minnesota, I went to the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, which is where John Dietrich, humanist preacher, got his start. One of the first Unitarians to call himself a humanist and be a known theist. So they have a really strong legacy of more than a century there, and they've been operating continuously and have had some relatively famous humanist, I guess you'd say, theologians or thinkers, philosophers lead their congregation. I believe David Breeden is still leading their congregation there. So those are good examples of long-standing groups. But then you look at something like the Sunday Assembly, which is, if you're someone like me who used to study evangelicals, it looks sort of evangelical in style. They're founded in London by Sanderson Jones and Pip Evans. And so they founded this thing that I think appeals to a lot of young people, and they've had some success. And I think some of those groups are going to have staying power. I don't really want to, I mean, we could sort of say, it's like, it's a market model, and there's going to be different things that appeal to different people. The way I think about it more is like, okay, if there's diversity in the market, what's the engine of the diversity? And to me, that's the secular paradox. It's the wanting more religion when your only options, more religion-like, when your only options are things like drinking skeptically, and wanting things like drinking skeptically where you just show up at a bar and there's no hierarchy, when all your options are too hierarchical. And so I think wherever you find a limited set of options, the secular paradox is going to push people to find something else, and there's always going to be this churn.
Yeah. No, and you made a great point earlier there that it depends on what success is. It might not be longevity. It might not be institutions. It might be just going out for beers with some people who, some of the people who come together, very unusual, very motley, but they're drawn together through atheism, and maybe that's when it's successful. How did secular people address proselytizing other people? Were there many that were there secular groups that looked to make more atheists?
Yeah. A
How'd they
lot of the big
do?
ones sort of, it's tricky. So there's a guy that I interviewed who's based in Los Angeles, and he gave me some great examples. One of the examples he gave me when I was asking him about this question indirectly a little bit, but you know what I was asking about. He said, there's a church down in Orange County that invites me sometimes to talk to their congregation. They want to kind of bring in an atheist and trot him out and ask him some questions. And he's like, they genuinely want to learn about atheism and who atheists are. But it's, of course, for them to strengthen their faith. And he understands that. And so when he goes and talks to them, he's not trying to make converts, but he said to me explicitly, hey, but if some converts get made, that's good too. And so it's not the main endeavor for most atheists. I think that there are some exceptions, like Peter Boghossian's written this manual for creating atheists that I spend a little time focusing on in the book, because it's sort of paradigmatic of certain contradictions that arise when you try to do something like that. But the deeper question for me that's really interesting is, are you deconverting away from religion, or are you also converting into something that is that affirmative presence? And that's a hard one. That's a hard question. So like Camp Quest, which is a set of children's camps for critical thinking, skepticism, they have to deal with this question because, they don't want to be indoctrinating children, but they also want a safe space for families that don't want any God talk and want promotion of science and critical thinking, and maybe have a worldview. You know who dealt with the same question, Ethan? I'm sure you know. It's like George Jacob Holyoake talked about capital S and lower S secularism in the 19th century. He's the guy who coined the term secularism. Was a British freethinker, and he saw capital S secularism as an ideology, and he saw lowercase s secularism as non-sectarianism or neutrality. And so this question of whether you're becoming something raises all kinds of thorny issues, but it's at the core of whether, non-believers should proselytize, because you don't want to be so much like religion that you're proselytizing. And then what are you doing? Are you converting people to things, or are you just trying to dispel them of their religious beliefs, which you believe to be irrational? It's like this little tree that starts branching off, and the problems stemming from the original paradox just multiply.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I really took away from your book is that there's not necessarily an answer to the question, like to any of these questions. You just have to say, like, yeah, it's like a paradox, and there's no way to resolve it. And I think, yeah, like with so many of these issues, there's just not a right answer. I mean, we do this bonus segment at the end, which is called "Can a True Atheist?" And like, people always struggle about how to answer these questions, and I think it really illustrates the paradox. One thing I mean, I can see like the time is going on, but we've got so many questions. One of the things I wanted to ask about is, you talk about this idea of secular misfits. Maybe you can talk a little more about that. Like, what do you mean by that, and how do they relate to this paradox differently?
Yeah, thanks. You're talking about the people who broke my brain and allowed me to see all of this. They're the people who had the best explanations for what it was that was going on and allowed me to get outside myself and my own assumptions. So, secular misfits are people who converted from religions other than Christianity, people like ex-Muslims, but also Black atheists who don't really fit into white mainstream atheist American culture for various reasons. People like Hispanic freethinkers who have founded their own groups for good reasons. And I, probably just honestly, very naively was like, why are there other groups? Why don't people just integrate into mainstream white atheism? I mean, I knew in some way there was an answer, but I didn't know what the answer was. And so I went and talked to people, and they just explained it, and they blew my mind. And so there's several just moments that radically transformed me. So there's one guy, I went to interview him in a suburb of Detroit, and he considers himself no longer Jewish. And it's one of the reasons, it was a strain on his marriage. He's now divorced. And he told me, my wife always used to tell me, you can't un-Jew yourself. And she was very frustrated with him about it. And he absolutely wants to do that. And he's extremely frustrated with his family, he's part of a larger Jewish community, with people around him who've known him all his life, who still consider him Jewish because his mother's Jewish. And so what that tells me is that Jewish is analogous to Christianity in some ways. It's analogous to being Christian, but in other ways it's not. Because Christianity is really the source of that analogy. So Christianity really structures what we mean by religion, so it also structures what we mean by secular. So he doesn't get to be ex-Jewish like his friends get to be ex-Christian. It's more complicated because Jewish can be a culture, it can be an ethnic identity, it can be a relationship to law, it could be a religion. And so that more complex way in which Jewish identity is born sort of tells us this story about how secular is always in this relationship, in particular with Christian, and certainly in the United States. And talking to ex-Muslims, it was equally clear. I went bar hopping with some in Detroit, and they're just fantastically kind people. And so, they're explaining things to me, and they're very funny. And it's hard to get out your phone and write down jokes when people are making you laugh.
Yes.
But fieldwork's awkward, so I did just that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this guy who told a very funny joke, but also just a very sad joke. And he was talking about growing up in the Middle East and how he's now in the United States, came to the United States to get an engineering degree, and how he's tried to get rid of the Islamic parts of him. He no longer understands dreams that he had when he was younger in the same way. He tells his stories about his family, in which maybe supernatural or ghosts might have been involved in very different ways. He's had to translate them into a different ontology, a different worldview. But he's like, the problem is what's left of my culture. If I take out Islam, what's left? The desert? And he's exaggerating, of course. But what he means is that being ex-Muslim isn't like being ex-Christian. You can't just cut out going to church. It's not going to work. You have to throw out an awful lot with that bathwater because it's not a perfect analogy. And he really struggles with what's left. Ishmael, who I talked about earlier, who really doesn't want to have any beliefs, he's removed all of the references to God from his speech. So he doesn't say Alhamdulillah, he doesn't say Inshallah. And when he's speaking Arabic to, the guy who runs his local deli, people find it really off-putting. And so he's really dedicated to carving out all of these references from his speech as part of his becoming more fully ex-Muslim. And it's a different level of intensity than it is for someone who doesn't want to say bless you or who cringes when someone says, oh my God. So secular misfits are people who don't fit the Christian-shaped hole that's left when you remove religion. They don't fit normative American secularism. And the excess of their fit, the way in which they might not have fully fill out the space, is deeply instructive for me. It sort of showed me how important Christianity is to our conceptions of religion, but then in turn, how important Christianity is to our conceptions of non-religion. And it was just a wonderful, mind-blowing education to go spend time with people who, saw fairly plainly what was going on and were very kind in instructing me.
Mm. And that's super important for introducing people into that community, like knowing that there is that difference. Joe, is there any other big takeaway you'd like to impart on people before we move on?
It's a great question. Thanks. I think one of the things, I think I just find myself slightly stumped by it, but I'll catch up. So one of the things that I think, maybe I'll say what I hope people might take away that I'm not fully explicit about, that I've been thinking about lately in some of the articles that I've been working on. I published one last summer, is it makes academics really uncomfortable in particular, but I do enjoy pointing out how much they share in terms of epistemology and other assumptions about the world with someone like Richard Dawkins. So I think what a lot of academics do, especially ones who are very well trained philosophically and understand themselves to be part of maybe the more critical parts of the academy or critical of the construction of the category of religion, understand it as having a colonial history to it. They imagine themselves to somehow stand outside. they're embracing that ancient skeptic idea of somehow having undone all epistemological foundations. But what I find again and again is they're empiricists like me, and that they actually have a lot of assumptions they haven't interrogated because they believe they've already done the work. And so I really hope that people see themselves in what I understand to be the secular tradition, like I've been forced to see myself. And I hope that there's a humbling moment for people to understand that, just because I'm critical of things doesn't mean my ideas, my feelings don't have a history. And so that looking into that history is important. Understanding the contingency of what I feel viscerally and what I really believe myself to know is important work. And I hope people do that, even though I don't know that I'm super pointed about making that clear in the book. So thanks for asking that.
Yeah.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think secular people, and maybe everyone, feels to some extent that they kind of stand outside history and tradition, like, but obviously it's not possible for anyone to do that, to sort of like, stand outside one's own culture or whatever. I think that's a really interesting point. So I guess we'll move on to the lightning round.
Let's do it.
And so I mentioned it earlier. So typically it's called Can a True Atheist? And it is these sort of secular paradox questions. Can a true atheist say, "Oh my God," for example? But I think we're going to change it, Joe, just to match your book, and call it "Can a True Secular Person?" So just give a brief answer. You can elaborate a little bit, but mostly a brief answer.
They're yes or no questions, but feel free to back it up. Show your work.
Yes, right. Yes. Okay. Can a true secular person believe in God?
Yes.
What?
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. One,
I'm starting to see the paradox here.
Yeah, I know, right? You just encounter it, and then so this is the problem of being an empirical scholar, right? Is I have to go I go and I look in the world, and I'm just like, oh, look, there's variety. There's
and there
like
they
a lot
are.
of people, and so I don't get to sort of settle it. I don't get to say like, aha, they are not. In fact, I just have to deal with the fact that there are. In fact, I interviewed a bunch of people who I would describe as hardcore atheists who will say very particular things. They'll say things like, well, if God is nature. Yeah, sure. I believe in God. And so then we're dealing with this language problem, right? So what I noticed, this is a whole can of worms, but I'll be super quick about it, is that there's a lot of literalism among a certain subset of atheists, that words can only mean one thing. So they want to disambiguate all the time, which is at the core of the practice of certainly the hard sciences. I think it actually undermines the ability of the social sciences to understand this constant urge to disambiguate. So when I sort of just accept that some of these words mean more than one thing, oh boy. So yeah, absolutely.
All right. Okay. Well, speaking of semantics, can a true secular person consider something sacred?
Yes. I think you see the pattern. Yeah, I mean, it's right. It's just I can't tell you how many conversations I've been part of and privy to in which people are having these semantic arguments, and it's just worth thinking about what we're doing when we're trying to define things. I've learned to have a very resentful relationship with dictionaries because I understand myself to be ceding my authority to somebody I've never met who wants to tell me that this is the ranking of definitions and this is the true thing that they mean, when in fact, Urban Dictionary tells it best. Give me the thumbs up. And these are all the things that a person can mean by a word. And then when when a word means, anytime I'm speaking, I have to deal with the fact that it's going to mean multiple things to multiple people. They might have an unclear understanding. So I'm trying to dwell in the confusion around something like the sacred and accept that there are absolutely people who have argued for secular understandings of the sacred and would affirm it.
Mm-hmm. Here's a classic one. Can a true secular person use the prayer emoji?
Oh, amazing. Yes. I really like the prayer emoji. Okay. I'm not sure whether I use it ironically or not. I'm in that paradoxical space. Uh-huh. I hope so.
Mm-hmm. All right. Can a true secular person celebrate their birthday?
Yes. Yes. So I interviewed a former Jehovah's Witness at one point. who told
Ooh.
me how important it was to his secularism to celebrate birthdays and Christmas, because those are things that he could not do.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so in
Right.
his secular
Yes.
misfit, his particular expression of high secularism was a total embrace of, you know, Christ Mass.
Yeah. I love it. I love the idea that an atheist wants to celebrate Christmas because
Yeah.
it's against their religion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of paradoxes
Yeah.
wrapped up. Um, can a true secular person dislike John Lennon's song "Imagine"?
I hope so. I certainly do dislike it. I think you're referring to there are several admissions I make in the book, and one of them is that
Yeah.
I've grown to despise John Lennon's "Imagine." It's a refrain at any secular event, and so I like the Beatles, but I can only handle so much
Right.
affirmation of
Yes.
the atheism of that song without acknowledgement of its deep anti-capitalism.
Right.
And
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think I
That's what I
just no
think.
longer like the melody.
Mhm.
It's been ruined for me. So I hope
Yeah.
so. But am I a true secular person? We'll have to let
Yeah. That's
the
another
heresy
question.
trial determine.
Yes.
Uh-huh. We've learned there are a lot of paradoxes there. Can a true secular person promote an afterlife?
Boy, I use the term I use the term afterlife all the time, but I suppose in a more metaphorical sense. I don't think Jacques Derrida has a very inviting oeuvre, but he's given me some great ideas. Haunting is one of them. And so the ways in which someone like, say, Karl Marx can have many different afterlives, and there's no one way in which Marx is understood and lives on, is a wonderfully useful idea for me. And then, well, it's too long an answer to get into, but there's a very secular understanding of what Buddhists mean by reincarnation as well, which I think points to a certain notion of, an afterlife.
All right. Here's a good one. Can a true secular person tell kids that Santa Claus is not real?
Yes. So wait, there's a possibility that a true secular person would tell kids Santa Claus is real. That would be the
Is
default
not
secular
real.
position.
Yeah, I guess the idea would be, like a secular person just going up to a group of kids and saying like, like Santa isn't real. Uh, can they do that, or should they do that?
Yeah, they can do it. I
Mhm.
think. I don't know. I don't have kids, so I don't. Maybe I don't feel properly protective of. Yeah,
Right,
they
okay.
certainly can. I'm
Okay.
absolutely certain that some of the people I spend time with, in fact, do such things.
All right. Okay.
Mhm. Can a true secular person make fun of religious people?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's an interesting debate in an emerging body of scholarship around the secularity of humor, whether humor is inherently secular, sort of tied back to some debates around blasphemy that happened among Judith Butler, Wendy Brown, Saba Mahmood, Talal Asad, about whether critique is inherently secular. And I think probably from the things I've said so far, the idea that secular is inherently this or that's going to ruffle my feathers. But I sure hope so.
hmm hmm All right, and the last one: can a true secular person want to be religious?
Yes.
Man,
I think it
secular
was.
people can do anything.
Yeah.
Yes, it's true. And I can find you examples of them doing anything. So that's kind of, but I mean, like, so, where we get the term humanist is by where it's like Comte's Religion of Humanity, Auguste Comte, the sort of
Right.
founder of
Right.
modern
Yes.
sociology. So he's got a very Catholic model for it. And we've had religious secularism for a long time now.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I've been enlightened and also perplexed by the
hmm
paradox.
hmm Yeah.
But I guess
How's
that's the
that?
point, isn't it?
At least we got it down to a paradox,
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That's,
Right.
if you could get it that close and it's just two things that can't be reconciled right next to each other, I
Mhm.
feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, that's not bad. It's just something we live with, isn't it? Look, if God can make a rock so big that he can't lift it, I think secular people can have a
Right.
paradox as well.
Yes.
Oh wait, or can he? That's now I'm
hmm
super
hmm
confused. Joe, anything you want to plug? Tell people about? Do you have a blog? You got should they follow you on the Twitters?
Follow me on Twitter. I'm an infrequent poster who is probably tends toward the sincere and awkward in my posts. But if that sounds fun to you, please. I'm at Joe Blankholm, and I'm working on some things, but they're academic things, and I'm not a good self promoter. So I'll post them on Twitter when they get posted. But thank you for that opportunity.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that was Dr. Joseph Blankholm, the author of The Secular Paradox on the Religiosity of the Not Religious. Todd, what were some of your takeaways from this episode?
Well, it's great that he found a term for it, right? Like we know that it's difficult to organize anti-religious people because they don't want to be organized into anything that looks like a religion. That's really good. And the book, which is fantastic, and I really need to read again and much closer, is singularly focused on the non-religious organizing around either like non-religious or anti-religious organizations, which is a very particular way of organizing, right? When you think about it, most secular organizations are not like that. We have tons of secular organizations that don't have the secular paradox, right? Like the government, Amnesty International, Walmart. I don't think they're not a religious organization, but these are all things that are organized on secular lines and don't risk becoming religions, which is fantastic, right?
Yeah, or even on a smaller scale, like if your local hockey team or something like, or local any sort of just meetup group that you're hanging out with other people. Yeah, I think these are not. Well, are they confronted with the secular paradox? I don't really think so.
I've never been like watching a game with a friend, and then they have the national anthem at the beginning, and then uh, we go to stand up, and I go, wait a minute, this is kind of too much like a religion, isn't it? No, but like
Yeah,
we don't
yeah,
even think about it, right? Because they don't
yeah.
look like what we think of as a religion.
Hmm.
I mean, if
Yeah,
like
yeah.
soccer in Europe, maybe you have that problem,
Y-
but
Yeah, maybe we're just gone off on a tangent, but certain kinds of fandom could be maybe almost religious-like, I suppose.
well, we got to repeat the three B's that
Yes.
right. So what is it? Belief, behavior, and belonging.
Yep. Yeah.
So there's a lot of belonging,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
there's some behavior, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a belief aspect. In you believe that, you know, well, like Taylor Swift or
Right.
something is like the best singer ever or whatever.
Yeah, it's ordained from God.
Uh,
But
yeah.
but this is one thing I kind of stumbled into at the end of the book is that what he made me think is that we're looking at it all wrong, right? Like the secular paradox exists because there are people who are putting on the brakes who want to stop themselves from forming something that's a religion. Most organizations are not a religion. The strange thing is that some organizations are religions and they introduce all this really wacky shit. That's where, like, why is it that some of these organizations produce massive groupthink, massive indoctrination, um, obedience, hierarchy, absolutism, to like the totalitarianism of a sky god? Like, why is it that these groups that are religions produce it and most other organizations don't? That's the weird thing to me. Maybe we should think about it more like that, and that there's something special about these organizations that become religions as opposed to the other organizations that are secular.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I just have.
well,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
throw it in the maybe pile and leave it there for a
Yeah.
while,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's something that the secular paradox allows us to think about, right? Like we we kind of fight becoming. I think most organizations fight becoming. Oh no, maybe not. Maybe the NFL is. I could see the NFL doing something like this, or the NRA being like, "How do we make ourselves more like a religion?"
Yeah. Right. Yes.
And
Yeah.
I mean, the NRA. I
Yeah.
think they're a nonprofit. How do we how do we make people pray? Oh, we say it all the time. Thoughts and prayers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of different kind of issues that, I mean, even just sort of at a basic level about what the law considers a religion and what sort of like what restrictions and privileges does that grant an organization, when the law declares that you are a religion. And I think, I mean, part of the secular paradox, I suppose, is just is like kind of confronting religion, this sort of like elephant in the room, I guess, that kind of looms over everything. And I mean, yeah, I mean, it's funny that in some ways, like very secular people, religion looms very large for them, maybe in some ways, because they really don't want to be associated with that thing. Um, it takes up a lot of sort of headspace, I guess.
I mean, it's a cliche by this point, but atheists are the only people who take religion seriously.
Right?
That's
Yes. Right. Yeah.
that's a big thing. Yeah, yeah. Think about it a lot. Worry about it a lot. Consider it. Don't want to be something that's part of
Hmm.
something that becomes a religion.
Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because, obviously, we don't spend a ton of time thinking about it, but I mean, obviously, we do this podcast and stuff, and like we read books about it, and like, so it's like we are thinking about this issue, like these issues a lot, um, which is, I guess, it's part of the paradoxical aspect of it. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Mhm.
We think about
Yeah.
it all the time. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, like my own life has really been wrapped up in it because, I with my doing my PhD about this research into atheism and so on. I mean, a lot of my life has been spent sort of thinking about these questions. When, yeah, so yeah, it's just an interesting
Yeah,
sort of thing.
and
Yeah.
that he. I mean, he's identified and experienced like how it's a that it's such a widespread phenomenon, and that everybody's got an experience like it. With the things, if you're an organizer and you've organized atheists, or you've tried to have a social organization, or you've tried to make a leap from just people sitting around in a room complaining about religion to doing anything, right? You've experienced these dilemmas. You've struggled with this, and the thing is, everybody does it. That's fascinating, and it is one of his points is that it's irresolvable, right? Like you can't make it into something that it people don't want it to be, right? That they're fighting against, and the um what this leads to for us in terms of like beyond atheism is the next step is, where does it work, who has done it, and we've talked to plenty of people who have. I think black atheists. Evan is definitely doing a great job with it. um, we haven't talked to Freedom from Religion, but we really should. American atheists, they've all confronted this. The secular coalition, all of them are doing it in very specific, pointed ways. Maybe that's a way you do it, right?
Yeah. I
Where do we
think,
go
I
from here?
mean, yeah. I mean, I think one maybe takeaway or practical takeaway from the book maybe is like almost you can avoid getting bogged down in these kind of debates like, well, is this too much like a religion, or is it not? And then I mean, and just sort of just almost sidestep those debates and say like, yeah, like you said, like it's not resolvable. Let's just get on with our work or whatever. Another issue is this question of, as society becomes ever more secular, what role should these organizations be playing, I guess?
Yeah, I mean it's and yeah, because part of it is we might just embrace the secular paradox. That might be a great way to win. Maybe like
Hmm.
yeah, maybe the thing is, look, if we're all atheists and we're all able to come together despite all of these crazy differences, maybe we should just hang out and have a few beers. Why not? That's and make sure and like bitch to other people who have the same complaints. Maybe that's really good. Because it's like he is the great comparison between ex-Muslims and ex-Jews and oh god, I can't remember who else was in there, but the ex-Muslims stand out because it's like that was their and that was everything, right? Religion was in every part of their
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
Whereas like we're not confronted with that anymore. Like it's like that it's a shrinking target. Religion has been getting weaker and weaker. There are more and more secular people. There are more and more people who are completely indifferent to religion. And I've met a few people who are religious, right? They tell me their religion, they have a religion, they can lay out their theology, they know exactly how God wants them to live. They live exactly how God has dictated to them that they live. And every Sunday, they make time. They make the time to sit on the couch and drink beer and watch NFL football for 6 to 8 hours, right? And these are people who consider themselves to be religious. Like, that's not a strong religious society. That's a society that's highly,
yeah,
highly secular.
yeah. I think that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but just one other thing to about the
Okay, good. We'll
ex.
do that. That'll be the
Okay.
capstone, and then we're done.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Otherwise, we might go on forever.
We can do
I mean,
this.
like, I was thinking about, like the ex-Muslims and how it's different living in a more sort of society with a longer kind of Christian history, I guess.
I
But
love
I
that
mean,
they
it
all
did.
drink. That was the best.
Yeah,
He goes out and
yeah.
drinks
I
with them.
like the this event they had called Haramadan, which is funny. But just that, if I were living in, a Muslim majority country and I was hanging out with other atheists, I mean, obviously, like, I think celebrating Christmas would be important to me, and obviously that would separate me from the other atheists,
Mm, yeah.
and I think, and make my case a little more unique. Whereas obviously that's the majority, belief here, or the majority practice or whatever. So I think I'm not sure exactly what the point is, but obviously, like, the kind of atheism that you have, differs based on what the culture is like in which that atheism is lived in or whatever. Yeah,
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 totally. And and Christmas is a great example, right? Like, and we don't need. I mean, I'm not advocating we don't not have these groups, but I'm saying if that's a goal, if this is something we want to do, which is like de-sanctify Christmas, make it raw and secular, or bring it back to its pagan roots, like you can do that without running into a secular paradox. It's just like, yeah, we're celebrating this day in this way because we want to, and that's why.
yeah. I mean,
Because it's important to us.
yeah,
That's great.
yeah. I mean, it's possible that eventually these secular paradox kind of just withers away with regard to like Christmas. I mean, it's pretty clear, I think, that Christmas is already well on its way to being like a almost entirely secular holiday. I mean, so yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe could have a very technical answer for how this comes about. And that all that stuff is in the book. And the book is really a very well balanced mix of this, like the anthropology, the hands-on anthropology, when he goes to places, describing what he's seen, describing his lived experience, and combining it with just a rich academic history, academic background, academic terminology. It's really well balanced, and there's something for everyone in there. This is one that I think, especially if you're an organizer, it's really I think it's insightful, it's useful and relatable. So
Yeah.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
It's
There's
I
just
dug it.
so much stuff where you're reading it and like it's just, it just makes things so clear, like these issues that have been coming up for us. It just seems so clear when he's talking about them. Yeah, and it's another thing to say is just it's super readable. It's not your typical academic book.
We spend
So yeah.
50 hours talking about this stuff.
Uh-huh.
It's just
Yeah.
confusion. He spends 20 pages typing about it, and it's yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So
But
yeah.
as for us, do you have anything coming up? I have nothing. I am a hermit, and I'm not really on the internet, but you are. You're on the Twitter.
I'm on Twitter, and you can follow me there at Nath G Alexander. Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah,
let
hit
me
us
know
up.
if you have any
We love reading your
questions.
responses. Nathan loves reading your responses. I love listening to him tell me about them. And yeah, recommendations, anything you got. Complaints mostly. Send those to Nathan.
Yep.
Um,
And
I guess
yeah, we
so.
got to we got to thank our patron supporters,
Absolutely.
Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus blog.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
big ups.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks. And if you can't pitch us a few bucks at the Patreon, linked below, least you can do, like and subscribe. That's free. Tell your friends, pay it forward. And thanks for listening. We appreciate you guys listening. And I think that's it. Until next time. Bye bye.